Today I'll talk about a rapid evidence review that we conducted on the topic of trustworthy digital identity. And in particular, we looked at what evidence exists about the nature of the relationship between digital and non-digital identities. This was work commissioned by SPRITE Plus and the Alan Turing Institute, and it was conducted by me at the University of Birmingham and Rob Dover from the University of Hull. So the purpose of this work was to identify good practice and gaps in the literature with the goal of informing a future research agenda for work on trustworthy digital identity. So, to be presented and discussed in venues like this. And we're given 4 specific research questions. What I consider the main one is the first one, which asks what evidence exists about the nature of the relationship between digital and non-digital identities. And in addition to that, we want to look at the other questions that ask what is the disciplinary scope, what methods does the literature use, and how are these moderated by different country and cultural context. So I'll briefly talk about the methodology, how we interpreted the research questions, the search protocol, and the screening process first. Now, interpreting the research questions is very important in an evidence review because it affects how we search the literature. And that in turn affects what we find and how we interpret the findings. And there are many terms that are being used to describe identity. People talk about digital identities, online identities, non-digital, offline, analog. And importantly, different terms are used differently across these disciplines. And today we saw several presentations talking about digital identities and approaching them in very different ways and considering different things being part of a digital identity. From an exploratory research on Scopus, we found over 20,000 results just for the term identity for the last 10 years. And that's obviously unmanageable. So after a meeting with the commission team and several exchanges of emails, we decided to focus on the literature that either directly addresses research on trustworthy digital identities or can potentially and conceivably inform future research on trustworthy digital identities. Now, what do we mean by trustworthy digital identities in our question? Because we know the Alan Turing Institute is heavily involved in technical aspects of trustworthy digital identities, we consider this more like a practical artifact that someone can use in terms of a digital identity, such as an application, right, a mobile phone application. And then the question comes, what exact terms should we use for the search? Again, we did an exploratory research in Scopus, and we found that the terms digital identity and online identity are widely used, but there's very little overlap between these two. So we decided to use both of these terms in our search. So our search protocol became this. We searched on titles, abstracts, and keywords on Scopus and Web of Science with the keywords digital identities or online identities. And because that was also an unmanageably large set of results, we added in the search terms terms related to the other 3 research questions that we had. So we looked at country, culture, international, ethnic, national, global, or Europe. Next step, so that brought us a number of results, which I will explain later. But the next step is the screening process. During this, we look at all the abstracts of the written results and try to see if they can be included in the review. And do they help answer our research questions? So the questions driving this process were, does the study report on the relationship between digital identity and non-digital identity? So studies that looked at not only one of the two, or that looked at something completely different, were not included. Does the study directly relate to digital identity technologies or trustworthy digital identities, or provide findings that can be useful for the design, deployment, regulation, or policy making of future digital identity implementations? This was very important for narrowing things down. Actually reflecting on this, thinking of the previous presentation, there was a lot of work that looked at theories of the self and how we construct the self, these things, but they did not present themselves as being possible to inform the digital identity framework or the design, deployment, or policy making of future digital implementations. So these were included. So there is, I think, some room there for people doing theoretical work to make a case where they can, that this can have practical applications. Another question that I've been in the process was kind of a check on our search terms. Does the study actually involve a specific country or culture, or does it discuss differences across countries' cultures? Then as a quality metric, to what extent does the piece provide evidence, or is it just a thought piece or something like that? So these are the detailed criteria we used. So in addition to these things that I mentioned, we limited our search to the last 10 years so that any evidence would be up to date. We looked at only articles in the English language, and we looked at peer-reviewed published work because that's more likely to provide useful evidence of acceptable quality. So overall, our search returned 602 results from Scopus and 366 from the Web of Science. However, there was a lot of overlap. There, about 80% of the Web of Science results were also included in Scopus. So these were removed as duplicate records. This also means that inclusion of further databases would have limited usefulness. So we screened 622 publications. This means that we looked at their abstracts and tried to see if they fit our goals. Most of those were excluded based on our criteria that I described earlier. And we ended up including in the review 56 publications. This means that we, the two of us, independently of each other, we read these papers in full, and we get our notes on how they answer the research questions, and then in a moderation meeting, we made their notes and discussed the nuances. Now, before I go to the main 56 articles, I want to talk about the larger set of 622, which includes those that were excluded, because that's a large number, and we could do some computational analysis there on the bibliometric data. They could be useful for context. So similar to something that Rob described in the previous presentation, we found a lot of work being conducted in what we call the global north. United States, Europe, English-speaking countries like Australia, and not a lot of work in places like Africa and China and Russia. In terms of country collaborations, there is a cluster, a very large cluster, the largest cluster in Europe, which includes United Kingdom. This is particularly, I believe, due to the work conducted due to European initiatives like EIDAS and a certain kind of funding that has been possible by the EU. There's another cluster that includes the United States, but interestingly, not other Western, as we call them, countries. Instead, the United States collaborate with countries in South America and places like India and Bangladesh. There's another cluster that includes countries in Eastern Asia, and another cluster there The green one, which includes countries in the Middle East. And looking at the evolution of the themes there are some topical things here and there, like at certain times COVID-19 was a big topic. Lately, artificial intelligence is emerging as a topic. Early on, there was some work on blockchain. But two kind of common themes throughout the 10 years are social media, because a lot of people want to manage different aspects of their identities online, and they do that via social media. And an interesting common thing present throughout these 10 years is the human aspects of digital identities. And it seems that lately it's growing in importance. Now, looking at the main data set, talk about the key findings. In terms of disciplinary scope, there was a large diversity of disciplines represented in the data set. As expected, a lot of work comes from a technical background, information sciences, computer science, cybersecurity. There's an interesting aspect, substantial amount of work published in healthcare sciences. This is due, I guess, driven by COVID, but also the need for health certificates. Similarly, substantial amount of work in business and management, and also hospitality and tourism. Again, there's a need for digital identities for people crossing borders. Substantial amount of work in political science and public administration. This is both due to the need to manage identities at the national level, and I believe also to address issues with migrants and refugees. And this amount of work in communication and media studies, which is again due to the work on social media research. In terms of geographical spread, in contrast to the graphs we saw earlier that were about the affiliation of the authors, this is about the geographical aspects of what the papers are referencing, right? So where the work is conducted. And again, we see a lot of work in Europe. Surprisingly to me, at least, not a lot of work in North America. It seems that that part of the world is yet to start working in this area. And this amount of work in Asia, Australasia, and Africa. In terms of methods, we identified 93 instances of methods being used, which means that many of the papers utilized more than one methodological approach. A common mix was a review of the literature and a method that sought to bring primary evidence base, but there were also cases where people just kind of threw everything at the wall. They were like, this is a very new thing, we're not completely sure how to deal with this, so let's try doing interviews and a survey and this and that to get a more comprehensive overview of things. Looking at the numbers, large number of interview studies, and other qualitative work like workshops and focus groups, as well as quite a bit of work in ethnography, which tries to get a much deeper understanding of how people deal with digital identity technologies, and relatively little work doing statistical analysis or kind of more hard methods like randomized control trials. The themes we identified in the literature, they included decentralized identity models, blockchain and SATs, quite a lot of work on ethical and legal frameworks. Like I said, a lot of work on online profile management, digital health identities, work on user adoption, which also includes some things that we mentioned earlier, like how do we educate people about the benefits of digital identities or the risks of digital identities and whether or not we should adopt them. And another distinct theme was what we call vulnerability, which includes studies that are not about the general population, but about groups of the population that they exhibit a vulnerability in some way. They could be either migrants or refugees or disabled people or people being prosecuted for some of their characteristics in terms of race or gender and such. And across these, there were cross-cutting themes such as national identity, clique identity, gender, sexuality, race, and religion. Some challenges and gaps were identified from looking at all this literature. We found a dominance of small data sets and a lack of large society-wide data sets. So studies tend to be particularly small. This kind of dovetails to what we talked about, the methods used, right? If you do qualitative work with interviews and focus groups, you necessarily have small data sets, but they're good at studying specific groups of population, but they don't necessarily generalize the whole population. Although we saw a diversity of disciplines being represented, there was little evidence of people from different disciplines working together. And I think there is an opportunity there. We believe there will be a need for larger scale, better funded initiatives, which can meaningfully support ambitious discipline spanning work. We found a lack of international research focusing specifically on interoperability from a technical perspective and bridging national level differences in the populations in the non-technical perspective. And importantly, we found that the term digital identity has been diluted by overuse. People just use it without necessarily referring to what other people might think they would refer. And there is imprecision in that usage. So we believe that the field would benefit from additional definitional precision. And lastly, some recommendations for future studies. It seems that where the research is going, it seems there's bound to be more work on decentralized identity systems or self-sovereign identities. Larger scale user adoption studies in real world context. That's difficult to do because in many cases we're in the early stages of these technologies. Interoperability in the national standards work on regulation and political and legal oversight, private security, and the social and ethical implications of digital identity technologies. And some ideas for high-risk research, be experiential or sandbox research, access to society-wide data sets, partnerships that are interdisciplinary or span sectors, so academia working with governments or the industry, and research in ethically challenging locations.